Hey there! Welcome back to Reddit Dating, best channel for cheating stories. Make sure to like and subscribe the channel for more spicy stories. She cheated on me with the guy that I thought was her cousin. Because this is something I'm not particularly proud of, it was thrown away because it felt like the logical thing to do at the time. This occurred in the year 1998, give or take a year. I was around 22 years old at the time and had been dating this lady for about 1.5 years. I was completely smitten with her because she was breathtakingly beautiful, intelligent, and hilarious. It didn't matter if she was just 1 year younger than me. She still lived with her father, who was quite strict. He has a number of regulations for her, including curfews, despite the fact that she is 21 years old. Amazingly, he assumed she was a virgin, despite the fact that I wasn't even her first boyfriend. Later on, he discovered that we were having and informed her that she would no longer be able to visit me. Even though we continued to date, it was increasingly difficult since she was often sneaking about. When she needed to come to me, she would often use her cousin as an excuse, but she would also regularly stop at his house for a long so she could have a plausible cover story to tell. She said that they had been really close since they were children, and that this was quite natural. I eventually discovered that her cousin was not, in fact, her cousin at all. She said that despite the fact that he was her father's closest friend's son, she had always addressed him as cousin and treated him as such. I began to notice more and more things that appeared out of the ordinary, and I became really suspicious. She informed me she was going to have lunch at a specific restaurant, and that she would then come over to my house. I received a message on my pager shortly after that, instructing me to meet at Red Lobster at 12 p.m., Then I received another mail informing me that the communication had been intended for her father. I flew over to the restaurant and located her vehicle, which I parked a long distance away. Another vehicle drives up, her cousin gets out, and they embrace and kiss each other before going inside the house. I went back to my house to wallow in my own pity. I informed her of my decision to cancel our scheduled date for that day, but I did not tell her what I had learned. I quickly devised my nefarious scheme. Please allow me to provide information concerning an event that occurred early in our relationship. A photo of her buttocks was taken by me with an ancient Polaroid camera one day when she was getting ready for work. Her buttocks were clearly visible in the photograph, and there was no way to identify her from it. I didn't expect her to be bothered by it at all. She erupted in a fit of rage. I've never seen her so enraged in my life. Despite the fact that she was ready to battle for the photograph, I made every attempt to keep her at bay. She tried to break it apart, but she was unable to do it. I instructed her to pass it over to me, and I would chop it up for her. She takes out a pen and begins to mark it up, after which she finds scissors and cuts it up. I set fire to the charred remnants in front of her. She remained enraged for a long, lecturing me on how she did not want any nude photographs of herself to ever be published. I can't emphasize enough how much she despised the notion of anybody having nudes of her on their person. She was really taken aback. During that time, she didn't speak to me for almost a week, and we were on the verge of breaking up, but she eventually realized that I didn't believe it would have affected her and that I would never do it again. Now, let's go on. I had my plan in place, and we had made arrangements for her to come to my house. I was living with my closest buddy in a nice home that we were renting, but I was still considered a bachelor. The furnishings in my room was limited to a bed, computer table and chair, dresser, and an alarm clock on the floor next to my bed, among other things. In the meanwhile, I walked into the kitchen and pulled out an additional chair, which I positioned at the foot of my bed. I went out and acquired another alarm clock, which I placed on the chair. It was my intention to make it stand out as blatantly out of place. She came over, and we had some together. I maintained my composure and managed to drag this out for another 2 weeks or so, having around twice a week. I made it a point to experiment with various postures and to keep her positioned in such a manner that the alarm clock was gazing straight at her throughout the process. I really wanted to keep it continuing, but I came to the conclusion that it was time to call it quits. Immediately before our departure on the final day, I disconnected the clock and placed it next to my computer, while moving the chair to a different room. I made sure she saw me, but I pretended like I was simply doing some cleaning. Because I was aware of how cruel my plan was, I began to have second thoughts about it. The day stretched into 2, and after approximately a week I made the decision to contact her and confront her about what had happened. I wasn't sure whether I was going to seek vengeance or not at this point. I called her and informed her that I was aware of her meeting with her cousin, whose name I cannot recall. She denied it, but I informed her that someone had informed me that they had seen them kissing. Even when she eventually accepted it, she insisted that it had just begun this week. I inquired as to how you were able to your cousin. She said that you are aware that he is not truly my cousin. We continued to dispute, and I informed her that I have known her for a month. Then she attempted to turn the tables on me by accusing me of not saying anything when I discovered what had happened, and she made a pretty smart statement that I can't recall. After that, I informed her that there was one more thing she should know that she would be very interested in. Me? Do you remember the alarm clock that used to sit on the chair next to my bed when I woke up? Her, that's right. Me? Have you ever questioned why it was there? Her, no, not at all. Me? Think back to the past few times we had, and how we did things like doggy at the foot of the bed, cowgirl with you facing the foot of the bed, and so on. Her, what the are you talking about, dude? My response? It was a spy camera, you filthy, cousin cheating me. I slapped the phone down on the table. For whatever reason, I had dialed the number from a pay phone. For the next few hours, my pager went off. It didn't stop vibrating for a good 30 minutes after I switched it back on before I finally shut it off. My phone at home was inundated with voicemails. When she sent texts, she would start out shouting and weeping before moving on to threats, beggarly requests, and bribe offers, and then she would cycle back around to start over again. She returned to my home the following day and pounded on the door for at least an hour, but I didn't respond. Despite the fact that the frequency had significantly decreased, the calls and texts continued to arrive for many weeks. Another time, she came to my place, but I never opened the door and I wasn't there at the time of her visit. Eventually picked up the phone and answered it, but when the caller began demanding for the recordings, I told her that I had no idea what she was talking about and hung up. Eventually, I would say something like, I don't know what cassettes you were talking about, after listening to her beg and weep. I got off the phone and never talked to her again. After a while, the calls and texts ceased, and I was able to go on with my life. There was never a concealed camera, but she is still unaware of this fact to this day. It was little more than an old radio alarm clock that looked clunky enough to pass for a spy camera if you weren't paying attention to what you were looking at. I came to regret it, since it is likely that it tormented her for a long period of time, and it just took me about 6 months to recover from my heartbreak. Story number 2. When my sister-in-law came out, they booted her out, so I forced them to sell the same home. When my sister-in-law was 18, she came out as a trans woman. My kind in-laws immediately booted her out of the home. They instructed her to leave the home and tossed her out at 8 p.m. with no money or paperwork, and her father also seized her vehicle keys. She had to walk 8 kilometers to our house. We brought her in because she was wailing. This is heinous conduct, but my husband and I would have just cut them off if that had been the only thing they did, but they doubled down. They refused to give up any of the paperwork, so my brother-in-law had to go over and storm into their home to retrieve them. They also cleaned up all the money in a joint account, which she had put up while working part-time during high school. They seized the money and also sold her automobile, which was registered to them. They were doing all they could to damage her life. My father-in-law is a small business owner, and his most important client was my company. I assisted him in obtaining the contract, which was quite valuable for him. My workplace was a family business, and long-term workers were regarded more as family than as employees. I was telling my employer about what had occurred. He informed me that if I could find someone within 5% of the amount my father-in-law suggested, he would pay the difference. They'd make the change. My father-in-law offered us really good rates, and he was very good at his job, but he messed up the contract because, even though we always bought from him, we weren't obligated to buy from him, and we could switch suppliers at any time, but he became complacent and assumed we wouldn't switch suppliers. It took me 6 months of agonizing trying to locate a supplier who could replace him while still getting us good pricing. This was not a large part of my responsibilities, and I had to put in many more hours than usual to identify the darn supplier, but once I did, I waited a month before alerting my employer. My in-laws had been planning a significant makeover for a long time, which would include demolishing a large amount of their home. Before alerting my supervisor, I waited until the remodeling work had already begun. The next month, we began receiving goods from the new supplier. It was disastrous for his company. It messed up his unit economics and forced him to search for new consumers. They ended up having to sell their home in order to save the company, and they didn't receive a reasonable price for it since the house was already half demolished when they sold it. My in-laws tried to extort money from my brother-in-law, but he ordered them to off. My father-in-law is a competent businessman, and he did dig his way out of the hole they made for themselves, but they still haven't purchased a new home after 8 years. They're still upset about what occurred, according to what I've heard. I mean, I was just doing my job, and if they had just evicted her, they would still have the home.